Hey everybody, welcome back to Watch and Carry. So in today's video, I'm going to do a quick review, first initial impression of the Kush Hi foot plates. So I've made a couple of videos now on the Kush Hi, and I just got around to doing my first ride today. I actually had my board serviced in my garage. Everything was taken apart, so was really happy to get it all charged up and riding today. And yeah, it feels really different. I wouldn't say it's mind-blowingly different, but definitely better, and I'm very happy with the purchase. So you can see here that I've got the Kush Hi here on the rear, and then I've also got it here on the front. I'll tell you a little bit about how I installed it on the front because I know that's a big topic of conversation. But yeah, so I did about 5 miles tonight. Just rode it, came back from work, rode it to the grocery and back. And let's see, initial impressions. So, going from stationary to getting balanced on the board, I definitely feel more balanced and more secure. And I usually when I go up, I'm still learning how to use the one wheel, so I get a little bit shaky with my feet. Nothing too bad, but having these concave foot pads really made me feel a lot more stable. One of the things you do when you balance yourself while you're stationary is you counterweight, right? So if you're putting weight here, then on the rear foot, you're putting weight here. And then if you're putting weight here, you're putting weight over here. So you're kind of counterbalancing your weight. And because these foot pads are so concave, that counterbalancing is just a little bit easier. Once I got it going on flat, straight, paved ground without any bumps, felt pretty much the same. I wouldn't say it felt a whole lot different than stock. I definitely felt a little bit more locked in on the front here and on the back because I usually ride with a wider stance, but nothing too mind-bendingly different. Once I got onto the sidewalk and I was, riding, the divisions in the sidewalk, bumps in the sidewalk, dips, when you kind of go on the off ramp on the sidewalk and on the on ramp, that's when I started to really appreciate having these foot pads. So usually with bumps, they're pretty noticeable, right? So even with keeping a bend in my knees, I can feel the bumps on the sidewalk and the vibration, and it really translates up the entire leg into the hips pretty noticeably. And on some sidewalks, the division or the bump has been so pronounced that it's even been a big enough vibration to throw off my footing. So if I was like this, my foot might go back a little bit, or it might change its stance. My front might also change. Tonight, riding the same route that I've had those changes on the bumps with my stance, I didn't have any of that tonight. I felt much more secure. One thing I did notice is, when you're going off of a sidewalk to cross a street and back onto a sidewalk, that little on-ramp, if I'm going at speed without these foot pads, just going on that on-ramp is a change in terrain. You're going from the street to the sidewalk, and riding that slope up to the sidewalk can be a little bit jittery. Today, I still felt the jitters, but it was so much easier to regain my balance and feel much more secure. How about comfort? So, 5 miles, you can't really judge foot fatigue on 5 miles. So I can't really give you a review on how this is going to help with foot fatigue. In terms of vibration, I will say that these foot pads absorbed, a pretty good amount of what I usually would be very conscious of riding. So I've done this grocery ride hundreds of times, and I pretty much know the same bumps in the sidewalk. So as I rode over those same bumps today, it was much more muffled. It was much more absorbent in terms of what I felt on my feet. And I've been using the same shoes, nothing really different in terms of anything else except these foot pads. How about carving? So carving was definitely a lot easier. Sometimes when I'm taking a big turn to the right or to the left, I would, decelerate a little bit because I'm always worried about kind of slipping off with the stock foot pads because they're so flat. This one, whether or not I was actually having more grip, it just made me feel more confident. I felt much more secured. I didn't feel like I was attached to the board, but I definitely felt a lot more connected. So yeah, I think it did a good job there. So overall, yeah, I would definitely recommend it. I'm really happy that I got this. Like I mentioned in the previous video, I bought these for I think 50 bucks each with the Black Friday sale. So I think, 200 bucks if I had to pay full price. I don't think I would spend it because I don't think it's mind-blowingly different at my ability. Some people who ride a lot better than me might appreciate the features a lot more, but at 50 bucks a piece, I think it's definitely well worth it. So what are some of the things that I like? Well, besides what I've already went over, the grip tape really complements the concavity as well. This is a lot stickier or a lot grippier than the grip tape that you get with the stock Onewheel. And then in the rear, not that I usually put my foot here, but the whole foot pad here is covered, not just that one sliver of grip tape there. So yeah, it's doing well. So let's talk a little bit about the front foot pad. So as I mentioned in my last video on the Kush Hi, you have a few options. You can go to that video and you can see that underneath Jeff has already made cutouts for the sensors. So if you have an XR or if you have a Plus, there is a way to kind of remove the stock grip tape, get that sensor out and transplant it on. Although having emailed and spoken with Jeff, he says that usually there are better results and it's much more common for people who own Pluses or XRs to actually just buy a separate version 1 sensor and then transplant that onto their Kush Hi and then put that whole assembly onto their Plus or their XR. So the reason why, at least from his video, his install video on YouTube, why people get the V1 is the V1 sensor layout is very different than the XR or Plus. From what I gather, the Plus and XR are really wide sensors, so they cover almost the entire board, versus the V1, which I think is just like a strip down the middle. I could be wrong about that. So why would that matter, having a smaller sensor? Why would that be better for this concave foot pad than the more broad sensor? You would think that having more sensors would make it easier to activate, right? So the reason is, when you have a concave foot pad, what you're doing is you have the same amount of pressure on this foot plate as if you just had a stock foot plate, but the distribution of that pressure is going to be different, obviously. You can see here that on the left and on the right, and then on the nose and on the tail of this front foot pad, that you're obviously going to feel a lot more pressure here at the edges if that's where your feet are than here in the center, right? Because of this increased incline going left to right and up to down, that adds added pressure to your foot. Now, even though the amount of pressure doesn't change, you're now shifting the distribution of that pressure from all over the foot plate to the edges, right? So now if you're shifting that pressure away from the center, those sensors in the center are not as easily activated or are not tripped at all by your foot. And so because of that, it can make it harder for the sensors to actually register a proper foot. It can make it harder for the sensors to register that your foot is on the foot pad if you were to transplant those XR or Plus sensors on there. So I don't know if that's true, but that's just my take, is that, the concavity redistributes where the pressure is on the foot plate. And by doing that, it can lead to maybe some sensors not being tripped if you put a Plus or XR sensor on the Kush Hi. So I don't know. That's my take. So what did I do to install this? So again, do this at your own risk. I did not want to mess with, taking the stock sensor off the stock foot plate. I don't know if it's easy. I don't know if it's hard. I just did not want to bother doing it. And I was also curious to see if I could just put the Kush Hi directly on the stock foot plate. There's also a guy on YouTube who did it, and it looked pretty easy, and it looked like he was riding well. So I thought, might as well, I'll go ahead and try it. So what I did was, obviously we have the Kush Hi here, and you can see I have my stock plate underneath here. And on my stock foot plate, the grip tape, the sensor, everything is still there. So what I did was initially I just put this foot pad on and I only attached the 2 screws here in the back. And then I rode around. Actually, I have a manual treadmill over here. So manual meaning there's no electricity. You just kind of, it uses your friction on your foot to move it. And so that's perfect for the Onewheel. That's how I practice rode this off, because I was a little too freaked out to try this in public. So I did that, and yes, I was able to get both sensors to activate, but I noticed that even the slightest heel lift would cause the board to register, okay, I want to dismount, and it would turn the motor off, right? So that told me, because just a little bit of heel lift was causing this to deactivate, I said that must mean there's not enough pressure on certain parts of the foot pad. And so what I did was I found out that putting this on top of the stock foot plate for my Plus, there was not enough pressure on here and not enough pressure here, running the whole length, right? And that makes sense. Going to back what I said earlier, we're redistributing that pressure to the edges because of the concavity, and so there's less pressure here by your feet in the center. So what did I do to make up for that? Underneath, okay, so like underneath the material, so between these two, okay, I found these pieces of adhesive felt, and you can see it right here. So it's sticky on one side and felt on the other. This is actually what they use to cut the shape and put underneath, something like couch furniture to protect it from being slid in the in your living room. So I cut some strips of that felt adhesive and I just laid it on 2 strips across here. And then I put the Kush Hi back on top, and then I reattached this screw, got back on the treadmill and with the board and tried it out, and it worked much better. It wasn't as sensitive. I could lift up my heel just a little bit and the board was still activated, but I would really have to heel lift. I would really have to do that conscious motion of lifting up my heel, or intentional motion of lifting up my heel to deactivate the board, which is how it should be, right? You don't want the slightest lift to deactivate. You want it to be an intentional lift of your heel. So it took some experimenting. I got it down. It felt great. After I figured out how to compensate for that, quote unquote numb zone here in the center, and I felt good riding it on my treadmill, I went ahead and I took off these 2 screws, reopened the cush, and then I applied RTV sealant. So I don't know if I have any here. Oh, here it is. So I applied clear silicone RTV sealant between the stock foot pad and the Kush Hi, all over, made a bunch of S's. Okay, except in the areas that I had those adhesive strips. And so the good thing with RTV sealant is that, it's actually meant a lot of times for car applications to adhere different materials or panels together. So it has a really good bond. Just put it all over here. It's also a little bit squishy when it's dried. So I don't know if I've weatherproofed my board, so I have a little bit of it here. Let me see if I can zoom in for you. And oh, here we go. This is good. So can you see right there? That kind of gluey stuff. It's kind of soft. You see I'm moving it? That's RTV sealant that's been dried. And so the good thing about that is not only does it adhere really well to materials like the stock board and the Kush Hi, but it's also a little bit squishy. So it still allows you to translate your pressure from your foot to the pad, and from this pad down to the sensor on the stock pad. So that's why I used it. And it's also really easy to remove. There's no chemical really you have to use. You can just kind of rub it off. So that is kind of what I did. After putting RTV sealant on the bottom of the Kush Hi, I took some adhesive grip tape. So just picture the grip tape here, but in strips. And then I put it underneath the Kush Hi. So that way there's not only the RTV sealant, but there's now grip tape touching grip tape. So grip tape that I just applied touching the stock grip tape of the stock foot pad. So that way it gives that RTV sealant something to bind to, and also it gives something a little more surface area for these 2 pads to touch each other. And then, of course, I secured these two back screws. Now, another question people have been asking is, how about the front screws? So I do have my screws in here. You can see them, 1 and 2, but these are actually just for show. These screws actually don't do anything. I just put them there so that way moisture, I super glued them in there so that way moisture doesn't drop down into there and collect. So why didn't I just drill a hole through my stock Onewheel foot pad and put a screw going from the bottom to the top? I'm not sure if I could have done that. You know, drilling a hole in that portion of the wood, even though it's on the sides, I'm not sure if that's going to hit any part of the sensor for the foot pad. So if somebody knows, please let me know. I didn't want to take that risk of drilling through a sensor, so that's why I didn't put them there. What I did do though is, you don't see it here, but on the bottom of the Kush Hi, underneath it, there are actually 2 screws. So your typical bumper screws that go here, that go up through the bumper and into the stock foot pad. On the Kush Hi, they actually give you, on the Kush Hi, they actually have 2 holes drilled here. So that way those 2 machine screws go through the bumper, can go through the stock foot pad, and then can go into the Kush Hi. But you just have to buy slightly longer screws than what usually comes with your Plus or XR. So I took those stock machine screws, I figured out the length, I knew the thread type already, that I think it's 10 by 32. Went to my Lowe's and just picked some up. So right now we have glue, touching grip tape, and then we have 2 screws that you can't see here and 2 screws securing this foot pad. So that's what I did. Now it doesn't look pretty when you do this, obviously, because now it just looks like you have this really odd stack of foot plates riding on top. So you can see this doesn't look good still right here. So what I did was that same felt material I told you about, I actually cut it to shape. And I was just doing this temporarily, but I actually think it looks decent. I mean, not great, but I'll take it. So let me show you what it looks like. And I'll have to get some light here. All right, here we go. Okay, so I cut that felt to shape, and I just kind of ran it around, and then it's adhesive, but I also applied some glue specific to fabric and silicone, and I just kind of ran it to shape like that. It looks really gray because I'm shining a bright light, but in person, as you can see earlier, it really appears black. It's hard to notice. So I've ordered more of this material, and I'm going to recut it. And I'm going to make it one continuous strip that runs from here, following this bumper, so it'll block this, and then running up here. And then I'm also going to do it on the back, because this material, like I said, is meant to go onto furniture, right? It's meant to prevent the furniture from scratching the floor. So it's meant to take a little bit of abuse. So I'm going to put a little thin strip here on the back, again, running, cut it to shape, running here and running here. So that way when I lift up my board from the nose like this, I don't have to worry about my bumper scratching. So, and also it'll just even out. I'll have fabric on both sides. So I don't know. We'll see how that looks. But anyways, so that's kind of what I did. And, let me put this in the light again. And you can kind of see it's not great, but it's not too bad, I think. I mean, you could use another material. You don't have to use this felt. I guess you could use something like this. This like matte-ish rubber material might be working also, but this is all I had lying around. So that's good. I don't know. Is there anything else to talk about with the Kush Hi? No, I think that's great. I definitely recommend it. I felt much more confident, much more controlled on the board, much more secure. I tend to lay my front foot like this and my back foot like this, and that seems to work really, really well for me. All right, guys, so that'll do it for today's video. If you have any comments, questions, or advice, please put them down below. And as always, have fun, be safe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.